Welcome to the EcoParent Podcast Network. I'm Sam, the founder of EcoParent magazine. My partner Alexis and I had zero experience in the publishing industry, no money, and a new baby. But we quit our jobs, leapt into the unknown, and started EcoParent magazine anyway. It was absolutely freaking terrifying. But at the same time, it felt right. Just a few years into the journey, Alexis was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer that later found its way to her brain. It was utter chaos, navigating treatment schedules, caring for a 3-year-old, and trying to run a fledgling business, not to mention the general emotional havoc. Alexis didn't make it, but the rest of us did, and I've spent the years since raising a wonderful son and building EcoParent into North America's top print magazine for conscientious families. Even 10 years in, we're still a very small crew. If you send an email, it's probably me that will answer you. And this podcast network is a monumental step for us, another leap into the unknown. But like before, it just feels right. And I know that Alexis would agree that the podcasting team I've assembled here is an incredible group of people whose only goal is to inspire the best in you. Okay, I'm going to shut up now and let you listen to the podcast. Thank you so much for stopping by. You're the reason we do what we do.
What is a teenager? This is the Raising Greener Teens podcast, and I am your host, Manda O'Fox Gillespie. On today's episode, we go together inside the red tent. I want to help you become the expert on caring for your own family and to help you empower your teenager to grow into the kind of curious, kind, and empowered adult who will do the same. But how? That's what I'm trying to figure out, and I'm taking you along for the ride. Today, I interview traditional Chinese medicine educator and feminine rhythms instructor Janine Mila to learn more about how to tap into the potential of the menstruating body through working with the physiology and psychology of the menstrual cycle. What are the myths that teenagers today still face when it comes to embracing bodies that bleed? And what is at stake when young women are encouraged to push through or negate their body's natural rhythms? We will explore all this and more in today's episode. If you also want your teenager to benefit from today's guest, you can have them tune in to my teenager, Teen-splain it, in less than 2 minutes at the end of today's episode. I hope you enjoy. Thank you so much for coming, Janine Mila, today to speak to us about transforming our relationship with our menstrual cycle. I am really excited to have someone talking about this important subject area, and I want this for my teenagers, but I also realize in talking with you and having your correspondence how much healing I have to do about my own relationship with my menstrual cycle. So I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit about your background and why you got excited or interested in having a more holistic, maybe I could even call it positive attitude about what our menstrual cycle is.
Thank you, Manda. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here. I am a teacher of traditional Chinese medicine at a massage school in Montreal, Quebec, Setsuko. And within all of that, I also have become a facilitator of this work called Feminine Rhythms. And that has been in the last few years. But I actually took the workshop myself, I believe about 11 years ago, or maybe 12 years ago, a long time ago. I took this workshop called Feminine Rhythms. In French, it's called Rythme Féminin. We're just in the process of translating it. It originates from Quebec. This woman, an herbalist, Sarah Maria Leblanc, started this work. And it's really something that changed my life when I took it. It changed my relationship to my menstrual cycle. And it really motivated me and inspired me when I started my practice and started learning about traditional Chinese medicine to bring more focus to women's health and to an empowered relationship to the menstrual cycle. So part of what I'm so passionate about in terms of this work is really just the idea of breaking down some of the taboos and some of the negative associations that men and women and people of all genders can perceive the menstrual cycle through. And so the whole idea of this feminine rhythms work is to really bring a sense of empowerment and to recognize and realize that the menstrual cycle is not a source of it's not a source of pain or discomfort, that it can actually be a source of empowerment and creativity and sensuality and connection to what it means to be in a woman's body, and that power and that strength.
So can you explain the menstrual cycle from the feminine rhythms perspective? Can you offer us a more holistic, like both what is going on physically in the body, but what else is there to think about?
Yeah, so one of the ways I like to talk about it is the menstrual cycle. It's a cycle. So just like the moon has its cycle and the seasons have its cycle, and those rhythms are an intrinsic part of nature, and they're also an intrinsic part of our bodies. As women, we follow those rhythms of the moon. And so the waxing and the waning of the moon and of the tides also is what's happening within our body over the course of a month. So what I mean by that is that there's really a time of the month when we're at our fullest, right? So the full moon is often related to the time of ovulation, right? Which is when we have the most estrogen coursing through our blood and we feel the most alive and engaged and empowered. And so those are the moments. In the first half of the cycle, we call the follicular phase. So the follicular phase is when the follicle develops, and that's the pouch that contains the egg, the ovule. So that follicular phase is the first half of the cycle, from the end of menstruation to a few days after ovulation. So that's the time of the month where we can feel a lot more positive and productive and dynamic and engaged in the world, and sort of a more of an outward perspective or, experience. And so that's a phase that's often very much celebrated by our society. And in our current day and age, we're asked to be very productive and to have a certain constancy in our productivity. Whereas within the cycle, there are fluctuations. So in that first half, we can access those energies more easily. And in the second half, we have a lot more progesterone coming in. And progesterone is the hormone, I like to think of it as progestation, right? So it's promoting the gestation of a potential fetus, right? So the energies are more focused inward. Once the ovulation is complete, then there's this waiting. Even if consciously or unconsciously we're not wanting to conceive, the body is waiting to find out whether or not we've conceived a fetus. And there's this real internal kind of quality to that time of the month that sometimes can be confronting to women, because especially in our society, that's not something that's very much celebrated. The internal aspects, the intuition, the dreams, the feeling sense, the body sense, that more introverted experience is not something that, really has a place in our day and age. So that's a time of the month really where we need to take care of ourselves more, and we need to listen to those messages that our body is giving us in that phase. And once we get to the time of bleeding, well, all the hormones basically leave the bloodstream, and it's sort of like this kind of death and this mourning and this letting go of the endometrial lining that was built up all throughout the course of the month. And it's a time where we really need to conserve our energy, right? And so often a lot of the pain that women experience, and it's because we're trying to push past our limits, not saying that that's the only reason. Of course, there's lots of reasons why we can experience pain, but sort of on the more psycho-emotional level. So if you think of it in terms of the seasons, that's kind of like the winter time. Winter time is not a time to run around and get stuff done. It's time to stop and hibernate.
I just want to break it down a little bit more, because I feel as, an older woman who's been menstruating for quite a long time, I have some sense of what's going on in my body, but not even everything I would need to think about where I am. The thing that I think is most obvious, right, is that what you called the winter phase, which is the menstruating, right? Like there's blood, we see that it's there. It's quite obvious. So there's these kind of two halves, the estrogen and progesterone parts, but there's four kind of subparts, you were saying. So the first one is directly after we start bleeding, or like 3 days after we start bleeding is the first one. Like, is there other things that are happening besides, our bleeding's slowing down? Or like, how do we know we're in phase one? And is it exactly a quarter? How do we know when we're out of it?
Right. Well, just to say the phases are not linear and they fluctuate between different women with different lengths of cycles, right? And different times of our life. Sometimes certain energies are stronger in different phases. For example, in menopause, the third phase is where it's most active. But when we're really talking about the menstrual cycle, the first phase is around 3 days after the first day of menstruation until about 3 days before ovulation. And this time of the month is really when, so even right when we start bleeding, already new follicles are being created. As they're proliferating, the follicle, which is the pouch that contains the cell that's destined to become an ovule, is the follicle that's most developed, secretes enough estrogen on its own to block the hormones coming from the brain. And so that stops the production of the further development of the other follicles. So it's kind of like that follicle wins the race. So there's a degeneration of the other ones. And so that one continues to proliferate, which then secretes more estrogen in the blood. And the mucus of the uterus, the endometrial lining, which is what coats the uterus, proliferates. And I like to think of it as kind of like we're preparing a little nest, right? So there's this kind of like bringing nutrients and soft cushions and blankets and like, we're preparing. It's this like the whole month is this preparing, right? So that's the first phase. And this is a phase where our sort of more masculine qualities actually are amplified, because even though estrogen is a very feminine hormone, it actually has some yang qualities in the sense that it brings us a sense of energy and joy. And this phase is really about focus and direction and clarities and this more action-oriented efficiency. So we have more mental energy to kind of focus on the things that we need to get done. So it's a very active and dynamic phase in that sense, a time to dare, to push our limits, to kind of put into action the visions and projects that may have come from the previous two phases, because we can kind of almost see the phase as a whole, sort of like the new moon and the full moon, where the new moon is kind of like a time to set intentions and to birth something from the darkness, and the full moon brings it to its sort of fullest expression. So we can even think of the menstrual cycle as an opportunity to create something new every month. So it's a time where we can sort of revisit what are our dreams and our projects and what do we want to put into action, because we have the energy and the focus to do that. And so we're more extroverted. We can feel more extroverted and more dynamic and engaged in that kind of way. And from a feminine rhythms perspective, we look at the different archetypes that might be active. So the archetype of the virgin or the inner child. So it's this very like youthful, feminine kind of quality. The rebel, Artemis, Athena, these kind of archetypes and goddesses that are sort of very action oriented and directive. So that's sort of what the first phase is about.
Yeah, I love that. And having an archetype actually in some strange way makes it easier for me to understand. And there was this part of my brain that is already wanting to take my calendar, and now at the beginning of my cycle, I'm going to do all my planning and organizing and thinking about how I want the month to go.
Exactly. Well, that's one of the ways that we can harness the energies of the cycle, because when we know where we're at in the cycle, we know, okay, this is the time to do that. Because, for example, in the third phase or in the last phase when we're menstruating, that's not the time to do that. That's not where we're going to be the most effective. And that's not where we're going to support what's naturally happening in our body. So that's one of the ways we're exploring this in the Feminine Rhythms workshops, actually to create a lunar calendar for ourselves and to be able to set out the times of the month where you can actually plan your schedule, knowing if your cycle is regular, of course, because not everybody's is. You can have a sense of, well, maybe I shouldn't give this big talk on the first day of when I'm bleeding, maybe I should push it back a few days so that I've started to enter into the new phase. So that's one of the ways to work with it. So the second phase is about 3 days before and after ovulation. So usually ovulation occurs, they say 14 days before the first day of bleeding, but it can be anywhere between 12 and 16 days. It fluctuates depending on the female body. And so this is a time of the month now where the cervix opens wider and positions itself in the axis of the vagina. So there's this actual shift in the position of the opening of the uterus to kind of prepare to allow anything to come through. So we can sometimes feel some tension in the ovaries as pain or discomfort in the abdomen. That's normal in terms of ovulation, a little pinching or something like that. That's a good indication that we're close or near ovulation. So at this time, the follicle stimulating hormone FSH and the luteinizing hormone, which is LH, increase and stimulate the follicle to swell and to burst, releasing the ovule into the fallopian tube. So it's a fully mature ovule. Now that's ready. It's ready to go. And so it starts to travel through the fallopian tube towards the uterus. So that takes a few days. At this time, the estrogen levels continue to increase, thickening the uterine lining and supporting the growth of immune cells in the uterus. So there's this kind of continuing imbibing of nutrients in the endometrial lining. And at this time, also, there can be a significant increase in vaginal discharge. So that's another way for us to know that we're getting to that time of the month. So it can be clear, wet, or slippery on the peak day of fertility. And this is really to allow any potential sperms to have a smoother journey to where they need to go in a biological sense, of course, as there might be different sexual orientations, but in the biology of the female body, that's sort of what's happening. And so in terms of the energetic qualities, so just as a follicle kind of opens itself to release the ovule, it's kind of a time where we can expose ourselves, we can expose our art, our offerings, our gifts. It's sort of in the moon cycle, it kind of reflects the full moon, right? So it's sort of like that fullness, that peak of energy and sensuality and creativity. So whereas the first phase is kind of more dynamic and yang, this phase is more radiating. So it's more about sort of like sharing our gifts and opening our heart and being in connection with community and with loved ones, and sort of this more receptive quality, still being more, dynamic and active than the last two phases. So we can feel stronger connection to the earth and feel more in tune with nature. And this sort of reflects more like the summertime, whereas the first phase is the spring. We can have more self-confidence and better communication, right? So this is a good time to have those difficult conversations that we need to have with people. Maybe not in the next phase that I'm going to describe, right? You can do things in other phases, but it's more about harnessing the strength of this phase. So this is a time where you can kind of harness these particular qualities of the feminine psyche, right? And so the archetypes are the mother, the queen, the one that sort of stands in her power, which is love, the power of love. And so it's a very heart-centered place when we're in balance. This is, again, also a very comfortable phase in our society because, the mother archetype is very much what is encouraged as women. We're encouraged to be productive and to be mothers, right? Those are sort of the qualities that in our society we're encouraged to generate. So usually these phases are more comfortable for women to face. Whereas,
one of my first thoughts, and it's interesting because then you went on to say this, is like, when do you have difficult conversations? So I appreciated you saying, okay, this is a more powerful or appropriate time might be in the second phase. And then I was also thinking, like, what an awesome way to model towards our teenagers, which there are often a lot of, I find, opportunities for difficult conversations. And what a great way to sort of be like, okay, like, let's have that conversation when we're going to be set up for most likely to have success, and to be able to have that as an introduction to a teenager about the idea of the power and the potential of the different phases. So anyway, those were the things that came to my mind in relationship to my direct experience. So I really like the examples.
I myself don't have a teenager, so I don't have that direct experience, but I can understand. And the way to be able to present some of this material to teenagers, for them to know that there's nothing wrong with them if they're experiencing something different, right? Because, and I'll get to that in the second two phases, the things that can come up are not really comfortable or recognized or spoken about in our society. So there can be sometimes an experience, and especially for young women and girls, that, well, what's wrong with me if I'm not experiencing this productivity or this like certain way of expressing and being a woman in my society? And so that's a huge piece, I think, of how I think this needs to be brought or can be brought to teens, is this understanding that whatever their experiences, it's not wrong, because it's part of a spectrum of experience and a cycle of experience that is always moving and in flux.
It just feels so much more powerful. Just that. I mean, I feel like I went through so much of my life before I was like, oh yeah, sometimes I just am more productive and think more clearly.
Mm-hmm.
And it was actually a friend who was like, yeah, so that's when you like make your meal plans or make your work plans or figure out the carpooling schedule or, you know, have the big meetings with your directors, whatever. And somebody else had to say to me, maybe there's a time for doing this kind of outwards thing and a time for what you're about to talk about, I think, which is to be more introspective.
Yeah, so that's the third phase of the cycle now. And this is about 3 days after ovulation to 3 days before menstruation, though again, it can fluctuate. There's no real strict time frame. So at this point, once the follicle has released the ovule, it turns into a corpus luteum, which sometimes is also called a yellow body. And so that sort of degenerating follicle secretes progesterone. And so that large increase of progesterone signals the body to keep the uterine lining intact. Because as I mentioned before, progesterone is progestation. So promoting gestation, preparation of a potential fetus to come and live in that space. So it also signals the pituitary to stop sending out FSH and LH. Remember, FSH is a follicle stimulating hormone. So no new follicles are being stimulated. And also at this point, a little bit of testosterone can be increased towards the end of this phase, hence sometimes the aggressivity that can come in this phase. So women, we also have testosterone, right? So that at this point in the phase, it can increase. So this kind of represents the fall, right? So it's kind of the time where we're returning inward. After the spring, the energy and the expansion of the summer, we're kind of coming back in the fall, and things are starting to feel a little quieter and calmer, or just we're being invited to come inwards more. So consciously or unconsciously, we're waiting for the potential of life. So we're waiting to kind of prepare to protect potentially and support a new life. So this phase is really about exploring, questioning, doubting, inquiring, rediscovering ourselves, right? So it's kind of like a limbo phase, because we don't know, or the body doesn't know, right? We might not be having any sexual activity, but the body is questioning. It's literally in a phase of questioning. So this is a time where we can question ourselves, for better or for worse, but it is a time to investigate and to inquire more and to introspect and self-reflect. And so we're often hypersensitive. Everything we experience is amplified, and we're closer to sort of the invisible and to our unconscious and to our intuition. So sometimes it's said that the veils between the worlds are thinner, like the veil between our conscious and unconscious is much thinner, so we can have more access to our dreams, to our intuition, to this sort of more intuitive, lunar, reflective aspect of our nature. So we can get grumpy or aggressive or irritated, especially when we're taking paths that are bringing us away from our inner process. So actually, you can perceive sort of like this archetype of like a wild woman, right? And she's kind of like at the entrance of the cave, and she's protecting the cave because there's something in us that's wanting to protect this inner process. So anything that disturbs that wild woman can come out and rage, right? Because she's really wanting to allow for that inner process to happen. So it's a time to kind of begin this descent into the cave, into our unconscious, into our shadows, into those aspects of our being that are hidden. And so if we don't do that process consciously, those things are going to come up to the surface one way or another, right? So either they're going to come up as bodily sensations, uncomfortable sensations, pain, symptoms that can come up. The premenstrual syndrome, a lot of those symptoms can come up, especially when we're not listening to our intuition and not listening to our felt senses. So our unconscious speaks to us through our body. So when we have those symptoms, there are often messages coming from deeper that we need to heed to and to listen to. And so at this time, it's a really good time to really use our tools like creativity, art, ritual, writing, dancing, shaking, screaming in the forest, running, right? Physical exercise can be really good to help to move some of those energies. And especially for teens, this is something I think that they don't have a lot of education around. Like, what is it to really be in touch with your intuition? What is it to be in touch with your unconscious, or your dreams, or those kinds of things. So I think as parents, inviting some kind of reflection, whether it's writing or drawing. I mean, a lot of teens and children are very connected artistically, naturally. And I think that maintaining that as a practice can be really helpful, especially at this time of the month. So rather than in the first phases, it's very sort of more linear. This is a time where we need to access the right brain, right? The right hemisphere, and those aspects of our being that are sort of not so black and white, that express themselves in many colors.
I just have to say, I love the way that you've described this, and I feel like, and if we were to also apply the same seasonal idea to our whole life, right, then many mothers of teens are actually and fathers, parents of teens are in their fall, in this sort of third phase of their lives. And I really resonated with the idea of both going inward, but also the questioning, the reflecting aspect of this. And then I thought the way that also is part of being a teenager, right? Like a teenager
absolutely
is learning the tools for questioning, for dissent, for healthy dissent, and they also really deeply, part of them, at least for my teenagers, they have this aspect that wants to just go into their room and be inside. I find my teenager, at least, is very outward focused quite often, but has this strong need just to be inside their room, cuddled up, listening to their music or doing their own work. And so I find that thinking about this phasally also shows me ways of connecting through these different stages, right? That there is this thing that I have to learn from my teenager about how they're giving this to themselves and how they can learn from us about this phase in our lives, how we are expressing, hopefully healthily, that aspect of questioning and going inward and everything else. That might not have been the perfect reflection, but I'm just learning with everyone else. So.
Yeah, no, and I think part of it is also like honoring that need to go within, right? Supporting that. So as a parent, being able to support that need, that it's maybe not a time to have that difficult conversation, but that it's maybe more a time where like to encourage them to self-reflect and to listen and tune in and have that sort of more inner dialogue. So then there's the last phase. And technically that can start a few days even before bleeding. So we can sometimes feel a shift. For me personally, I have this thing where on day 26 of my cycle, it's like clockwork. I will have some kind of like, I feel like a volcano erupts, whether it's some kind of like emotional release or I don't sleep all night or whatever it is. And then there's like a calm that comes once I've been able to sort of deal with that or process whatever it was. There's a sort of calm that comes even before I start bleeding sometimes. And it's funny because my partner is often like, if I have something going on, he's like, is it day 26 already? I can get to that point, of detail sometimes where you can track these patterns that can reoccur. So for me, I can have so much more compassion for myself when I know that, okay, this is going to happen and it's happening and I know why it's happening. And it's not to dismiss it because it's just premenstrual, so it doesn't mean anything. That's not what I'm saying, because it's actually, we must not dismiss what comes up in that time. It might be exaggerated, it might be reactive, but whatever's coming up is coming up because it needs to be seen and heard and embraced and processed. And so I think part of what I want to bring through this journey, through the cycle, is that we can have compassion for ourselves in these different phases and understand ourselves without feeling like there's something wrong because we're at that point. The wild woman, just to speak a bit more about that archetype, because there are other archetypes, we can say the barbarian, the wild woman, the visionary, the one that sees kind of through the veils. And this is an archetype that's not very spoken about in our society or embraced. The woman that is fierce, that does not care about social norms, does not care about trying to please or meet other people's needs. The wild woman who is just a primal, force of nature. That's the archetypes of this phase. And that's an archetype that teenagers, I don't think, get to experience in their in our Western culture, it's not something that is really portrayed, or when it's portrayed in films or shows, it's portrayed as an evil character, right? But there's this power and there's this force there that I think is something to kind of explore and to bring in a creative way and in a positive way to youth.
I love that. And I also feel that idea of the archetype, and that there are these different archetypes that are contained within every woman, I think is also a call out in some ways to, as a society, to rethink the archetype of a teenager, almost, right? I find that in society, we often approach the teenager as an archetype, as if they are this thing of disruption, and I find a lot of our rules, a lot of the way we address them, a lot of the way we educate towards that area often feels to me, kind of as an outsider, because I'm not in that phase anymore, like we're trying to control and suppress something that feels quite uncontrollable. I think that's for all genders of teenagers, but then it clearly goes on to be a lot of how women and men and they can feel quite stuck. And I also just want to reflect on one thing that I think is so interesting and maybe complex about this cycle, which is that it's not built on the obvious, right? It's not just like, okay, you bleed and that's the beginning of something or the end of something, right? It's all based on this many days before you ovulate, which is this many days before you menstruate. And it's all just a mystery in some ways. So you giving some indicators that it's not just random mystery, that it is actually a mystery that we have tools to begin to see into, feels really empowering.
That's great. And I think that that's a huge part. I know for myself, when I was a teenager in high school and I learned about the menstrual cycle, we learned maybe like in an hour, just the basic hormones or whatever. But when I took this course and realized that, hormones don't just have physiological functions, they also impact my mental and emotional state and the state of my physical energy and my psyche, right? And so that is the huge piece that I want to bring, and I would love to see more. And that's always been kind of a dream for me, is to bring this work more into high schools, because I think that it's important to kind of educate men and women and people of all genders in terms of what is actually happening, because I think that the education and the empowerment go together, right? So if young girls don't know, then they can't understand and embrace, right? So hopefully this can give a little bit of an insight into it, but it definitely is the tip of the iceberg in terms of how much mystery is there. And so a big part of this model is these 4 phases. There's a way of working with a lunar calendar where you can track your symptoms, track your dreams, track your moods, and be able to start to see like certain patterns emerging, right? Because like you said, it's just not linear. I'm saying 3 days before and after. For someone, it might be completely different, right? So, and that's the beauty of the cycle of life. It's not linear. It's not something we can always calculate. So hopefully this can kind of give a broad sense of being able to embrace that sort of more cyclical aspect of it.
I started asking questions before we got to the 4th phase. This can happen sometimes. I get overly excited. So walk us through the 4th phase.
Yeah, I'll just finish with this because it's a juicy one too. But the 4th phase, right, is a few days just before bleeding, right, and a few days after bleeding as well. So obviously, if the ovule hasn't been fertilized, then the corpus luteum, which is the generating follicle, will get reabsorbed into the body. And so the yellow body, the corpus luteum, is what secretes progesterone. So once it's reabsorbed, then progesterone halts. So the secretion of progesterone halts, which is what triggers the shedding of the endometrial lining. So basically, in layman's terms, the body realizes you're not pregnant, and then the shedding of the endometrial lining is what is happening when you're bleeding, right? So you're shedding a whole layer of your uterus that was sort of built up over the course of the months. And like I said, in the first day of bleeding, already several follicles, like 3 to 30 follicles, are being stimulated to begin their growth. So new life is already occurring at the beginning of the bleeding time. So in terms of the energetic qualities, this kind of represents the winter time, right? So it's like the most internal, the darkest time of year. It's about retreat and rest. Energy collects towards the inside. There's a tremendous loss, right, of life force. Like this whole juicy nest that we built is being decomposing and shedding, and we're releasing. So there's a lot of energy, and from a TCM perspective, a traditional Chinese medicine perspective, we're losing a lot of blood, which can lead us to experiencing depletion, fatigue, and all kinds of symptoms. So at this time of the month, we have little to no energy for the outer world, really, in terms of our physical body, in terms of our mental, emotional body. We need that energy for the inside. We need to kind of collect and harness that and focus on ourselves and focus on rest. And in a symbolic sense, it's a time to mourn the death of the potential of life. Whether or not consciously or unconsciously we wanted to conceive, it's still a certain death, right? And so the ovule doesn't necessarily represent just the birth of a human life. It can represent the birth of a project or of a dream or of a relationship, right? So any kind of loss that we may have experienced in the previous month this is a time where we can more acutely experience it, which is why we might feel more emotional, more grief, more sadness. And this is normal and it's healthy. It's actually a time for us to grieve and to let go. Just like in wintertime, it's a time where all the creatures are resting, right? It's also a time where we need to do that. We need to rest and replenish ourselves. It's also a time to sort through things, like kind of like what's useful, what's not, right? It's that kind of like letting go and shedding. What can we let go of to shift our life so that things can feel more aligned? So it's a time to journal, to reflect as well, but especially to really self-nurture, to take baths, to rest, to be quiet. Left brain is at its least active. So having to like think or process or engage in conversations is probably the last thing really we want to be doing, especially in the first day or two. And so this respect of this time is really important. So if we really allow ourselves, even just the first day, a day of rest, we can more fully replenish our energies to start fresh on a positive note for the next cycle. But if we push through, this is not a time to push through our boundaries, right? And to kind of push ourselves. This is a time to really surrender and receive. But if we do push through, then we can have actually a harder time in the next cycle because we're not properly replenishing. So it's kind of similar. If in winter we don't rest enough and we continue to be active, then come spring, we're going to be exhausted and we won't really be able to start fresh again. So this is a really important time. And this is one of, if you or whoever's listening remembers one thing, that the first day of your bleeding time is the most important time to take care of yourself and to put yourself first and to rest and slow down as much as possible. In our day and age, it can be difficult if you still need to go to school or to work or whatever it is, but to cancel as much as you can, to take an evening to yourself, to have a bath, to shut yourself in your room if you need to, whatever it is, to really just allow yourself to rest fully. It's essential to allow your body to replenish and prepare for the next cycle.
So recently, one of my daughter's friends was prescribed hormonal birth control, even though she's not sexually active, for her acne. Mm-hmm. And she was excited about this, especially because a lot of her friends at her school are taking hormonal birth control and skipping their periods altogether. And I am assuming that you would say that we don't want to do that, but can you, there's physical harm that we can look up that might come from this, but what else are we denying ourselves from this perspective if we do not go through that cycle? And is it just the menstruation that we're denying ourselves, or is it just the flow of blood that we're denying ourselves, or are we also denying ourselves something more?
Well, that's a very complex and large topic that we can go far with, but I'm going to try to give a short answer. From a traditional Chinese medicine perspective, when we start menstruating, so going from, let's say, a young girl to hitting puberty, what happens often is, so in menstruation, one of the most important organs that help to regulate the flow of blood in menstruation is the liver. So the liver often has to adjust to this kind of new role at puberty. And the liver is also responsible for sort of detoxifying the system as well. And so very often hormonal acne, for example, can come up for this reason, because the liver is in this phase of adjusting, because it kind of has this whole new job, right? But I'll just say that when dealing with acne, from my practice perspective, diet is the biggest piece. So the main contributors to acne are usually greasy foods, sugar, dairy, and gluten. And that includes chocolate as well, because chocolate is a big one that contributes to acne. So all of those tax the liver. And so from a Chinese medicine perspective, there are so many ways to deal with acne other than working with birth control. So I mean, it's kind of appalling for me that that would be the number one recommendation, because I've worked with a lot of teens and adults with acne and have successfully treated it using simply just dietary adjustments. Sometimes need for a little bit of herbs or doing some acupressure to rebalance the organs. Now, in terms of other hormonal dysregulations, for the same reason, because the body is adjusting to this onset of puberty, there can be some imbalances that might show up within the first year of even starting to bleed. The cycles can be irregular, the cycles can be heavy, there can be pain, there can be spotting, there can be bloating, all kinds of things. And some of that can be managed through, diet and herbs and acupressure from a Chinese medicine perspective. So, and some of it is just something that's going to regulate itself out, because it's a new experience, and the body is learning how to work with all these new hormones. And the liver is the one that also is responsible for hormones. So it's receiving a lot of stress. And so working with the liver with certain herbs as well can be really powerful. With birth control, it's a sticky situation, because once they start, usually they stay on it for a long time. And there's the certain types of birth control that make you skip your period. There's a negating of this essential cycle and power, right? So it's kind of like saying, just stay within the first two phases. Just don't go into any introspection or reflect. I'm talking about in a symbolic sense, not in a physiological sense, but also because that they're denied of this certain physiology and the body becomes dependent on these external hormones, we're losing touch with this sort of innate primal wisdom that we have in our bodies to know how to fluctuate through these cycles. And when we lose blood, we're also shedding a lot of toxins. So it's actually a really healthy expression and release, even though it can be painful. It's a very healthy release. And it's actually quite celebrated in a lot of cultures. There are a lot of cultures in which there are rites of passage to represent this transition. It's a transition where all of a sudden a young girl has the power to give life, right? So it's denying that sort of more primal gift and power that I think all women should have access to, and creating this idea that it's bad or it's shameful or it's painful or unhealthy or there's something wrong. That's the narrative in our society around menstruation. So I think re-educating in terms of beliefs is the number one. And then, of course, there are certain tools that can be helpful to navigate some of those more specific dysregulations or dysfunctions.
Thank you. It's a really lovely answer. So at what point would you say, oh, something is wrong? So I like that idea of like when a young woman starts menstruating, right? It's like your body is figuring it out. There's a lot that's being turned on that has to find some sort of rhythm. So at what point, both like in how many years does it need to go on and not being comfortable, or what level of like discomfort or bleeding or et cetera, would you say, oh, something's not like, this is not just time is going to fix this?
So from a TCM perspective, what's considered normal, and I'm putting that in air quotes for those who can't see me, that's a word that's very charged. So let's use the word balanced. So what's balanced, what's considered balanced in terms of length of cycle is between 26 and 30 days. So the specific 28 days is not, just because you're bleeding 29, you might fluctuate between 27 and 30. That's normal. When it gets below 26, like 24 or 23 days, that's a very short cycle. That's a sign from a TCM perspective that there's a lack of the yin energy. So what's what we call a yin deficiency. And when it's a longer cycle, so over 30 days, then it's considered more of a yang deficiency or a lack of yang. So we would treat it from that perspective, but that might be too much information in terms of from a diagnostic perspective. But in the length of time, the average is about 26 to 30. So in terms of the length of the actual menstruation, generally between 3 to 7 days is what's normal. Usually the first 1 to 3 days, it's normal for there to be some heaviness. And then after 3 days for it to be lighter and spotting. If the heaviness persists after 3 days, that's a sign that there's an imbalance. So there's what's considered balance is that there's a significant flow, at least in the first day or two. In terms of the quantity, it's hard to talk about because it depends, how the blood is being sort of perceived. But if, for example, you have to change a pad every hour, that's too much. Or a Diva Cup, which is a little menstrual cup that you can hold blood in, if that needs to be changed, every hour or two, then that's too much, right? So I think most women will, or young women, hopefully will be able to sense what might feel like too much, but that is sort of maybe a general indicator. In terms of pain, it's normal to have a little bit of dull pain in the lower back or a little bit of dull cramping. That's considered to be balanced. It's okay because actually the uterine is experiencing contractions when we're bleeding as part of the shedding. So that's considered to be normal. But when it becomes debilitating pain or sharp pain or stabbing pain or pain where we can't think or we can't move, then of course that's something that is considered to be an imbalance. As well as premenstrual symptoms. So there can be bloating, digestive imbalances, mood swings, back pain, sleep issues, anxiety, depression, a whole range of things. Some of which, like I said, to a degree, there's a tendency towards getting into sort of like the shadowy aspect of our nature in that premenstrual time. So some of the more psychological aspects we can't ever fully escape because they're parts of us that need to kind of come out. But of course, if it's persistent and recurring and debilitating, especially in the physical sense, like breast tenderness or bloating or severe depression or anything like that, then of course, those are signs of imbalance as well.
Are there a few strategies that you can recommend for kind of all menstruating people that will help with the pain, but also with the imbalance aspect? So everybody knows like, okay, we can take an ibuprofen if we're in a lot of pain, but I have to imagine that's not actually helping bring you closer to balance. So are there things that kind of balance the short-term discomfort with the long-term trying to get something into a healthier, feel better rhythm?
Yeah, so I'll just say that pain and imbalance can come from many different places from a Chinese medicine perspective. So there's never really like one thing that works for everybody because each person has a different constitution and a different presenting imbalance, a way of presenting the imbalance. That being said, a few things that I can mention, let's say just for pain. One of the things that I love to suggest are Yin Yoga postures. So Yin Yoga is a really great way of restorative practice. It's not restorative yoga. It's slightly different because generally we're holding less supports and allowing the body to be kind of stretched and pushed a little more than in restorative to stimulate the meridians and the flow of energy. So one of the poses, for example, is the butterfly pose that if anyone's ever done yoga, you're sitting down and you bring the soles of your feet together and your knees fall apart and you bend forward and you can sit up on a cushion as well. That one is really great because it activates the whole lower back and sacrum area and stretches, and some of the pain is also coming from the back as well. So we kind of can address the back and the front in that pose. Another one that's really great is that same position with your legs, but lying down on the ground. And you can prop your knees up with pillows if your hips are not super open, and just placing your hands on your belly and breathing deeply. So the breath is a really helpful tool as well to release back pain. There is a magic point in acupressure that is really powerful for painful menstruation. And it's a point, it's kind of hard to describe, but it's located between the last lumbar vertebrae, so L5, and the first sacral vertebrae, S1. So between L5 and S1, in between the vertebrae, it's often a very tender point, especially when you're experiencing pain. But it's a really great one to press on your daughter or partner or whoever is in pain. It's kind of hard to get to oneself, so it's helpful to have someone else work on it. And of course, having hot beverages and hot foods are really important. So heat, hot baths, heat packs, drinking warm beverages. Raspberry leaf tea is one of the best teas to have throughout the bleeding time. It's not always going to help directly with pain, but it is really, really nourishing for the uterus and supportive, and something that can help the menstruation overall. Cramp bark tea, or pimbina, is a tea that's excellent for pain. So it's a bark that you boil, and it kind of has a weird kind of bitter taste, but it is very effective at helping with pain. So those are a few little tidbits.
So you started mentioning a couple menstrual products, and I think you mentioned the Diva Cup. Do you have a way that you approach thinking about selecting menstrual products that you could share with us?
I don't really have an approach, but I would say I like to support women to discover what feels best for them. I would say I'm not super supportive of tampons for various reasons, including the toxic shock syndrome risks. So I do like to support menstrual hygienic products that are natural and chemical free and organic, and that also allow some kind of a relationship with the blood. And so that's kind of an element, again, that is very taboo, and most people are very uncomfortable with menstrual blood or blood in general. But I do think that it's important and healthy for the person who's menstruating to have a relationship with their blood, to be able to see it, to be able to touch it, to be able to quantify it. So the Diva Cup is a really great way, because you can insert it and have it in for a long period of time, depending on your flow, but it can be for a day, and you don't have to think about it. And when you empty it out, you can empty it. I like to give it to my plants, because it's actually very nutrient. Imagine all of those nutrients that are being sort of generated in your uterine lining, and that then you can give those nutrients back to the earth. So that's also a really beautiful ritual and practice to kind of honor the blood. So it's not just something dirty that you're flushing down the toilet, but it's actually something that is rich with life that can be honored and sort of appreciated. So that's the Diva Cup is great for that. And then just organic cotton pads are really great. So from a sort of more environmental perspective, like pads that you throw away or tampons that you throw away, it creates a lot of waste. So of course, it's sometimes a bit more work, because if you have an organic cotton pad, you bleed in it, then you just put it in like a bowl, or I put it in like a yogurt container with cold water and soak it for a little while, and then you can squeeze it out and just throw it in the laundry machine. So it's not a ton of work, but that way you're not actually having to generate waste. And I think it's also really healthy and important to have moments. So whether you're using the Diva Cup, or if you are choosing to use a tampon, it's important to have moments in your cycle where the blood can flow freely, because it's actually really healthy for your whole bacterial flora, the vaginal flora and the vulva, for all of that to be flowing and to not have something in the way of that. So that's something I recommend at some point in your cycle, to make sure that you're allowing that flow freely.
I just want to say that if nothing else, if we could just move away from tampons, well, I have to say, from an environmental perspective, for a human health environmental perspective, bleached tampons, which create with dioxins, which are horrible for human health, but also that the plastic applicators. I live on a beach. I can't tell you how many plastic applicators have come washing up, because where are they going? I mean, like, people, I guess, are throwing them down the boats, toilets on the boats or whatever, and they're ending up in our oceans for a second of use because you can't figure out how to get a tampon in without it. So if you really need an applicator, there are ones with paper, at least applicators, but I feel for the whole world when I see those.
I hear you. I hear you.
There's billions of women. Anyway,
I also want to mention that there are these wonderful new like menstrual underwear that are coming out that I really love. That there's one group of women in Quebec that started them. They're called Madame Novary, and they're like black and red and like very nice looking, you know, like it's not like an kind of like an ugly thing. It's like they're actually nice underwear, and you can reuse the pads, or you can just wear the underwear if you're having a light flow and you just continue to wash them. And so that's another really great one that I find.
I only discovered menstrual underwear. I mean, I don't think they were really a thing when I was young, but when my daughter started menstruating, we got a bunch of menstrual underwear, and they are amazing.
They are.
So maybe actually in the program notes, I can put some links to some of these products that you can introduce your daughters to. Actually, I think what I want to ask is what you would share also with non-menstruators, right? Because I think like there is this thing to learn that it's not just for our daughters, right? It's for those who were born with bodies that don't menstruate, however we identify. So what would be like some of the takeaways that you wish that everyone would learn about the menstrual cycle, whether or not you yourself are a menstruator?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I think the takeaway is that it's beautiful and that it's healthy and powerful, and it's something to be celebrated and to be understood and honored as much as possible. I just wanted to mention one other thing in terms of like a takeaway for hormonal balance. I sort of mentioned briefly the power of food, but I wanted to just plug in this thing that I love and that I learned in the last few years called seed cycling, which is a way of using seeds to regulate hormones, because different seeds sort of promote and have different nutrients that promote and regulate the hormones. In the follicular phase, in the first 2 weeks, so from menstruation to ovulation, the seeds that are recommended to eat are pumpkin seeds and flax seeds, and it's 2 tablespoons ground flax seeds, and it could be raw or ground pumpkin seeds, 2 tablespoons a day. So it's something that needs to be done regularly, but if that's included in your diet, it can help to support that part of the phase. And then in the second half, it would be 2 tablespoons of sesame seeds and sunflower seeds in the luteal phase, which is from the beginning of menstruation.
And does it have to be seeds, not the oil of?
Yes, the whole seed. It's all right there.
It's so cool. I think I'm going to do this. You can put it on your oatmeal. You can put it on your whatever that you're eating.
Exactly. Yeah. And so in terms of where to find more of this work, one of my biggest inspirations is the book called Women's Bodies, Women's Wisdom by Christiane Northrup. She has written so many books on women's health. She's a gynecologist who's revolutionized her field. And her whole first chapter is all about like dissolving the myth of the women's body through the lens of patriarchy and how much our culture has actually influenced our belief and our unconscious beliefs even. So whether or not you raise your child in those beliefs, in our society, those beliefs are there in terms of like a woman's body is wrong or bad or these things. It's a really interesting resource for parents as well to kind of look at some of those things. And there's some really great diagrams and drawings of different parts of the female body. So it's a really great resource book also for different imbalances that can present and so on. So that's a book I would recommend. And then in terms of this particular work, well, Rythme Féminin is saying in French because it originates from Quebec, and a lot of workshops are being given in Quebec, all across Quebec. There's also a whole France contingency, so lots of workshops are being offered in France. I am newly established here on Cortez in BC, and I'm hoping we're in the process of translating the body of the work into English so that I can offer this work here. Hopefully this summer, we'll see how things go, but you can look up Rythme Féminin if you're Francophone. You can look it up. There's a Facebook page and there's a website with more of information about that work. And in terms of my work, I have a private practice here on Cortez. I'm also available to do long distance consultations in terms of working with diet and herbs and supporting different chronic imbalances. My specialty is women's health. So really supporting this is my passion. So my website is ayniholistic.com. So AYNI holistic.com.
Thank you so much for your time today and your perspective and your wisdom.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, and I hope it can bring more light and insight into this whole realm of things.
Hi, Zella. Welcome, and thank you for being here to Teen Splain this episode.
Yeah, of course.
I'm wondering about periods and how you and your friends talk about periods and whether it's only girls that talk about them these days.
I mean, it's still kind of a jinxed thing, honestly. You feel embarrassed about it, even though almost every woman goes through this, and you still don't want to talk about it, which I think is messed up, even though I do that. And I feel like it's gotten a little bit more open, especially with like males and stuff, but to a certain point you still just like don't want them to know and don't want to talk about it, and you're very embarrassed if like you ever leak or anything.
Why do you think there is still this taboo around talking about periods, and not just talking about them, but kind of celebrating the natural cycle that the menstrual cycle represents?
I think it's because people's reactions, especially when you're a little immature, can be something like, ew, that's so gross. And then you're kind of just ashamed of it for the rest of your life. Or you grow up in a household where you're raised not being able to talk about it, or not having any older siblings, or just not having the support you need, where you just feel like it's taboo.
What about if you grew up in a household where your mom or dad wants to celebrate it and have a party and have you go to monthly moon circles, etc.?
It's definitely not better. You kind of just feel even more embarrassed about it, and especially because usually around the age you get your period is like 12 up to late teens. And if you get it when you're younger, 9, 10, 11, 12, you're so embarrassed about it, you don't want to talk about it. Even at 15, definitely not something you want to do.
Have you ever heard of that idea, comparing your cycle to the cycles of the moon?
Yes, I really like that, and I've heard it before, and how people refer to it as like the moon cycle and stuff like that, and I love that. And I definitely saw some of that in myself.
Is there anything from today's podcast that you're going to actually share with your girlfriends?
My girlfriends don't usually listen to me. We're teenage girls. We're really headstrong. We will do what we want. If we don't like what we're hearing, we won't do it, or we won't hear it.
Thank you for sharing things from your point of view today, Zella.
Yeah, of course. I love sharing my point of view.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Raising Greener Teens. I hope you learned something today to both empower and inspire you and your teen.
So, if you listen to podcasts or watch YouTube, you've probably heard it 1,000 times before. The plea to subscribe and leave a review or a comment. Well, here we are again. But seriously, the review is especially important to us, as it has a huge impact on our discoverability amongst the zillions of podcasts all competing for your attention. So please consider leaving a review. And heck, we'd really love to hear your feedback. This pilot episode of the EcoParent Podcast Network was made possible with the generous support of Ontario Creates. Thanks for listening.